Believe it or not, Ryan Day admitted scoring touchdowns on 19 straight possessions is not reality, as Ohio State faced reality in the victory over Penn State. We welcome in Dan Hope from 11warriors.com. And Dan, thank you for joining us tonight on College Football Weekly.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Let's talk a little about that Penn State game. It was a little bit of a wake-up call for the Buckeyes, particularly on offense, where they ran into some trouble with the Penn State defense.
Yeah, definitely a bigger test. We had seen, you look at those last few games against Rutgers and Maryland and Indiana. I mean, it just looked so easy for the Ohio State offense. And then to see them go against a Penn State defense that hadn't allowed more than 23 points in any game all year, it was definitely tougher sledding, especially in the running game. Ohio State really struggled to get going in the running game. And then in the red zone, only 1 of 6 in terms of scoring touchdowns in the red zones. I think that's the big stat you can look at and see that things didn't go quite as smoothly as they had been going for the Ohio State offense. But still, to put up almost 500 yards on a Penn State defense that hadn't allowed more than 400 yards all year, I don't think it was a terrible performance by the Ohio State offense, but I think certainly a big emphasis for the Ohio State offense this week is going to be finishing drives in the red zones and not making mistakes, because we saw, a lot of false start issues, snap infraction issues, little things like that contributed to those issues that they had in the red zone. And so I think that's going to be a big point of emphasis this week to, do those little things well so that this offense can really get back rolling again.
Yeah, all those pre-snap penalties on the Ohio State offense, at times it almost felt as if Ohio State was the road team because they were having trouble adjusting to the great crowd at the shoe, the Scarlet Knight at the shoe, if you will. And it was very interesting to see Luke Whippler had trouble with the snaps and just all those pre-snap penalties. Ryan Day mentioned he didn't think it was just one thing on all those things. It was a couple of different things that are playing into a factor, and that's going to come back to discipline, and some guys are going to be running some laps this week.
Yeah, and he pointed out that, Penn State was doing a lot of pre-snap movement, which was something they hadn't really seen a lot from other defenses. So I think that's certainly going to be something they're working on in practice this week, is how to prepare for that and how to adapt when maybe you see things on the field that you didn't see on film. I think Penn State brought some things that maybe they hadn't shown in previous games, and Ohio State just wasn't quite prepared for it. So that's going to be a big point of emphasis this week, is preparing them for different things that they might see that are trying to get them off guard. And you got to give Penn State credit. They found a way to slow down this Ohio State offense in a way that the last 4 teams they had played really hadn't been able to do at all.
Something that has become a point of emphasis for Big Ten fans, particularly this past weekend, has been the officiating. Ryan Day was quite diplomatic when asked about some rather blatant holding calls that were not called against Penn State on the Ohio State rushes. And it's an interesting situation. You don't ever want to blame officiating for a game, and particularly you overcame that officiating to win the game. But that certainly is a topic of conversation among many Big Ten fan bases this week.
Yeah, it is. And, I think there's certainly some calls that you can disagree of. Certainly, I think there were some, holding penalties that went uncalled. But, at the same time, I don't look at it and go, well, that's the reason why this game was close. I mean, I think you look at it offensively, like we talked about, it was, not running the ball efficiently, not scoring in the red zone efficiently. And then defensively, it was the struggles to get off the field on 3rd down. And sure, I do think there were a few times where Penn State made big conversions where they got helped out by a penalty that wasn't called. But at the same time, when Penn State's 11 of 16 on 3rd downs or whatever they were, you can't blame the refs for that. You got to blame your own execution, your own scheme, whatever you've got to do to fix that, because that's something we've seen as a recurring issue for this defense at times this year, and something that is probably going to continue to be an issue unless they figure out a way to fix it.
One other officiating topic before we move on. Ryan Day with an interesting idea to address the penalty for a targeting call.
Yeah. I mean, certainly. I think one thing that I've noticed about Ryan Day this year that we didn't see as much from him in the last couple of years is that he's become more willing to put himself out there and comment on things that he disagrees with within the sport of college football. And this was another example of that today, where he mentioned that he thinks targeting should be changed to a 30-minute penalty rather than a 1/2, or basically Steel Chambers. It's basically a full game penalty now, because he was ejected on the first play of the second half and now we'll miss the entire first half of the next game as well. And his point was, well, if that had happened on the last play of the half, it would still be the same penalty as next week. So he thinks it should be a 30-minute penalty. I don't know if I necessarily see it changing that way, because that feels a little bit complicated to me. But you respect the fact that Ryan Day is defending his players and is starting to make his voice more and more heard on topics in college football.
Let's talk a little about the Buckeye defense. As Penn State was able to move the ball, Ohio State did get some pressure on Sean Clifford, did a good job there, but there's a lot of underneath routes that were there, and the Nittany Lions were really able to pick things apart underneath in the middle of the field. Is that going to be an issue going forward, or is that a defensive scheme where Ohio State was basically saying, we'll give you the underneath stuff, we'll let you have those long drives, and then we're going to buckle down and force field goals on you?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we've seen some issues with that from the Ohio State defense this year in terms of giving up those third downs. And I think they're playing a lot of soft zone there in those situations, and they are giving up a lot of those underneath things. So I'm going to be interested to see, especially as we get into some of those tougher games, against a team like Michigan State in a few weeks, a team that can really move the ball, to see if there's some more schematic adjustments to try to stop those things, because I do think that's been an issue this year where teams are picking that zone apart a little bit. And I think some of that's, the linebacker play has not been great. I think that's still a weakness for this defense. I think we've seen the defensive line step up in terms of generating more pressure. And that ended up being really the thing that, really saved the defense, I think, against Penn State, is we saw some really big third and fourth down sacks from that Ohio State defensive line that helped get them off the field. But it felt like when Clifford had time to throw, he was always able to find some hole in that defense. And so I think that's something they got to work to shore up, is not leaving those holes. Because it's not a matter of, the corners outside just getting beat on deep balls. It's more of a matter of there's holes in that zone that opponents are exploiting. And execution's part of that, but scheme is too.
And looking ahead, we saw Penn State had success going up-tempo against the Ohio State defense, and Michigan State had success going up-tempo against the Michigan offense. In 2 weeks, Ohio State hosts Michigan State before the game at Michigan. Is that up-tempo offense something the Spartans can use to hurt Ohio State? Is that something the Buckeyes need to work on the next 2 weeks? Because Purdue can go up-tempo as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're going to see this team get tested the rest of the year here, because I think even Nebraska this upcoming week, they're 3-6, but they're not a pushover. I mean, this is a team that they've played 3 top 10 teams, and they've been within a score of them. They haven't lost a game by more than 8 points this year. So I think there's going to be plenty of tests to come for this Ohio State team. And I think, we're going to, I think every single one of these games is going to be a measuring stick of how good this Ohio State team actually is, and if it's good enough to win a Big Ten title and get back to the college ball playoff.
Let's talk a little about this matchup with Nebraska. As you touched on, Cornhuskers 3-6. They don't have a bad loss, though. All those losses have been by single digits. Is this a Nebraska team that is due for an upset, or is Ohio State confident that they've got Nebraska's number, because outside of 2011, they have owned the Cornhuskers in the brief series?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can look at it 2 ways with Nebraska. You'd say, well, the good news is they haven't lost to a team by more than 8 points. The bad news is they've been in 6 one-score games and they've lost all of them. So this is a team that's shown it can be competitive, but it hasn't shown that it can actually win those competitive games. And so do I necessarily see this being the week that changes for Nebraska? Not really, but I also think at the same time, Ohio State needs to go into this game expecting a test. Ohio State cannot look at this game as a walkover game, because one thing I wrote about last week on 11 Warriors is the similarities of this season to 2014 and 2017. It's followed a very similar blueprint to both of those seasons. And if you think back to 2017, the 8th game of the year, they play Penn State, they end up in a dogfight. The next week they go and they lose 55-24 to Iowa. So to me, I think this is going to be a telling week. How does Ohio State respond? Did they come off a tough game and really play their best this week and fire on all cylinders again? Or do they have a hangover for a tough game and leave themselves ripe for an upset? So I think this is a big week for Ohio State to really respond, to make sure it keeps the momentum going as it gets into a really difficult month of November if it's going to make or break this season.
We'll leave with this. Whose seat is hotter, Scott Frost at Nebraska, Jim Harbaugh at Michigan?
I think it's got to be Scott Frost right now because, I mean, Jim Harbaugh's loss at Michigan State, certainly these rivalry game losses are adding up for him. And if they lose to Ohio State, I think there's certainly going to be some noise there. But I also think by and large, Michigan has exceeded expectations this year, being a 7-1 team, a top 10 team right now. Whereas at Nebraska, Scott Frost, unless Nebraska can find a way to win Saturday in the last 3 games of the season, this will be Nebraska's 5th straight losing season, including all 4 seasons under Scott Frost. He has not gotten Nebraska to a bowl game yet. So to me, if that seat's not getting hot at this point, I don't know why it isn't, because we just haven't seen any real progress from the program that he's trying to build there.
Buckeyes and Cornhuskers at noon in Nebraska. I want to thank Dan Hope from 11warriors.com for joining us. Dan, enjoy your trip to Nebraska.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Mark.